They found it in creek beds and under red clay hills. Flecks of sunlight turned to metal, and a handful of men holding pans learned overnight that fortunes could be born out of Georgia mud. But this wasn't just a story about shiny metal and lucky strikes. It was a turning point where law, hunger, and violence collided. A moment when a gold rush ripped through the lives of a proud people and set in motion one of the darkest migrations in American history. Over the next 20 minutes, you'll see how a discovery meant to enrich a region instead became the hinge that swung a nation toward dispossession, coercion, and the forced march that would be called the Trail of Tears. By the time the last coin was minted in the mountain town of Dahlonega, thousands had been uprooted, treaties shredded, and a map redrawn by greed. Listen closely. The echoes of those choices are still with us. Before the ruckus of pickaxes and speculators, North Georgia belonged to the Cherokee people. Their towns were organized and cultivated. Their farms and homes threaded into a landscape they had known for generations. The trees lining the creeks were not just scenery but markers of stories and of law, a living claim to home. In the wider United States, the early 19th century was an age of expansion and appetite. Settlers pressed west, states flexed political muscle, and cash crops demanded new ground. Then, beginning in the late 1820s, faint rumors of color in the streams reached the ears of white prospectors. At first, it was a trickle of curious men and a handful of small claims. But whispers became newspaper blurbs, and by the end of 1829, those blurbs read like a declaration. There was gold here in Georgia, and it was accessible to anyone willing to wet a pan. Imagine a quiet valley where families tended orchards and children ran to school. Then imagine hundreds, then thousands, arriving with shovels and greed. Gold plus demand equaled pressure on land rights. The Cherokee people found themselves staring at an influx they had no legal way to stop, while white settlers, emboldened by state governments eager for wealth and expansion, began to assert claims that ignored the sovereignty of those who had lived there longest. The discovery triggered a fever unlike anything Georgia had seen. Towns that once served as crossroads swelled into makeshift mining camps. Entrepreneurs and con men, families with wagons, tavern keepers, and preachers all followed the glint. Dahlonega, a name that would later be stamped on gold coins, became a magnet. Sluices ran, claims were staked, fortunes were dreamed. But the success of a panful of gold depended not only on luck, it also depended on law. Georgia's state government, sensing both opportunity and threat, moved quickly to solidify control. Laws were passed to extend state authority over lands long recognized by the Cherokee as theirs. Courts and local officials began to treat Cherokee titles as obstacles to be overridden rather than rights to be honored. A state's claim to expand its borders of power collided with a people's claim to existence. A judge in a town hall issued rulings at the same time a family was hoeing a garden that suddenly found itself described on paper as vacant. Legal maneuvering became the engine that converted miners' hope into a political mandate for removal, and the machinery of justice was turned in ways that benefited the rush and punished the rightful occupants. When law and politics meet, history often hinges on a few critical decisions. The Cherokee, resisting dispossession through petitions and legal claims, took their fate to the highest court in the land. In a landmark ruling, the court affirmed that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community with rights that federal law had to respect, a decision that, on paper, recognized the limits of state power over tribal lands. But a courtroom verdict is only as powerful as the will to enforce it. At the same time, the federal government, motivated by expansionist sentiment, by pressure from states hungry for land, and by the siren song of gold, moved toward policies that would make legal protections meaningless in practice. Washington's choices mattered enormously. An act passed in the early 1830s offered the federal government the power to exchange Indian lands east of the Mississippi for lands to the west. Promises were made and then undermined. Treaties were negotiated with small groups who did not represent the full will of their nations, and politicians argued that removal was inevitable and even benevolent, a paternalistic claim that would ring hollow in the months to come. The highest court said one thing. The momentum of politics and profit did another. The Cherokee sought recourse, but the levers of power were already set in motion. By the mid-1830s, the pressure to vacate the land reached a brutal crescendo. Negotiations and legal appeals gave way to coerced treaties and forced evacuations. A treaty signed by a minority claiming to represent the Cherokee transferred vast tracts of ancestral land to the state, and the clock began to tick. Families were told they had to leave, and when enough chose to hold fast, force became the method of compliance. Those rounded up to be marched west faced days of exposure, sickness, and loss. Food shortages, cold, and mismanagement turned the route into a slow attrition of life. It is estimated that thousands perished along the way, children, elders, mothers, and fathers, whose only crime was being in the path of expansion. The Trail of Tears was not a single day of sorrow. It was months of suffering inflicted by policy. Dressed as progress, in towns where gold had once been sluiced from streams, the glitter was now bordered by sorrow. The wealth extracted from the land had a human cost few of the claimants recorded on their ledgers. Gold, as it often does, generated wealth, but not evenly. Mines and mints sprang up. The United States established a branch mint in Dahlonega, and coins carrying the soil of these hills circulated as if to prove the land's new status. Yet, the people whose lives had been uprooted did not receive compensation commensurate with what was taken. The land was repopulated, farms and towns grew, and a new economic order emerged that would define Georgia for generations. Still, history does not erase memory. The Cherokees survived through adaptation, cultural resilience, and a stubborn insistence that their story be remembered. In the decades that followed, debates over justice, restitution, and historical accountability would flare and be quelled, flare and be quelled again. Today, monuments and museums try to tell both sides of this tangled story, the mining camps and the mourning camps. But the sharp edge of what happened resists easy reconciliation. There are places where you can walk the creeks and see the old mining cuts. There are places where descendant communities continue to wrestle with loss and with the meaning of home. As you consider that contrast, ask yourself which stories get told in history books and which are left at the margins. This is where the narrative must stop and the listening must begin. The Georgia Gold Rush gave us a small, shining paradox, a moment of sudden wealth that exposed the worst forms of human decision. Greed bent law, law bent lives. The result was a shift in the nation's moral geography that endured long after the last nugget was panned. But this ending isn't final, it is a prompt. When you look back at the map of the United States and at the names on the rivers and towns, what will you see? A map of progress, a map of theft, or both. The real question the story leaves us with is not who owned the land in 1829, but how a society chooses to balance profit against rights and whether legal protections mean anything if they can't be enforced for the powerless. That's not an abstract matter. It's a living issue that shapes conversations about land, law, and memory today. Take a moment to imagine you were there. Would you have stood with the laws that promised justice, or with the hands that reached for gold? Which choice would you have made, and why? The answer you give is the place where history meets conscience. When the wagons finally left, when the mint shut its doors, and the towns settled into new rhythms, the hills remained. But those hills carry different stories depending on who tells them. The gold that glittered in the water paid for new economies, but it also paid for a wound, a bruise on the conscience of a nation that called itself free. Remembering the story is not about choosing sides for the sake of argument. It is about recognizing that the past shapes the present. The next time you pass a plaque or a museum window that speaks of Dahlonega's golden years, listen for the quieter narrative of loss that walked out with those who were forced to leave. History is messy, uncomfortable, and insistently human, and within that mess we find questions we still need to answer.